Chapter number 10 this evening. Exodus chapter number 10. We've been slowly working our way through the plagues of Egypt. And I think the tragedy in all of this is we continually see an example of Pharaoh's hard heart, time and time again. Most of us can sympathize a little bit because we've probably been there, hopefully not to this extent. But we at least can understand the idea of a hard heart. Here now, though, we're going to move on from, of course, the initial plagues were rather humorous in nature, mildly inconvenient maybe. And then we move on to the more of the economic plagues. Now as we begin to slowly progress, God keeps increasing the amount of intensity as he begins to go through these plagues. That's where we find Exodus chapter number 10. Tonight we're going to be looking at the devastating plagues. I know we're all watching, or most of us, maybe you choose not to watch the news, I understand that. Or maybe you just try to minimize how much you look at it. But if you watch anything, we understand that there's a continual escalation between Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, well, no, not Hungary, but us, NATO, and everybody else. Seems like they're doing it's tit for tat. Somebody does this, somebody else does that, and back and forth. One of the more alarming things to me is if you watch any of what's going on with the cyber warfare in the meantime, what is and is not being hacked. Evidently, in the last number of months, we've seen an increasing number of food processing plants and fertilizer plants burst into flames and have strange and unusual automation malfunctions, both here and in Russia. Someone added them up recently, and I think it's 25 or 35 in just the matter of the last few months. Many of them burning all the way to the ground. And you start thinking, in addition to all of our inflation issues, in addition to all of our other potential food shortage issues, this doesn't look good. And then we do a little bit more, and then, or maybe somebody is doing it, or perhaps it's just a lot of negligence. Seems a little odd to me. But regardless, it seems a little concerning. Why? Because it's hitting us in our stomach, of all things. What is it Napoleon used to say? An army marches on his stomach. We think it's not nearly as severe as a war or as actual conflict, but from what I've been told and from everything I read in history, starvation is actually a whole lot worse than most wars. I know it's hard to have one without the other, but recently my grandmother sent me an email of some of the reading or some of what she's been listening to, and she sent me a documentary of the Great Famine of Russia. Now, I know I like to read about the Holodomor in Ukraine, the terror famine, where 3 to 10 million people died in between World War I and World War II. It was a planned famine. But then you look at the ones where people, we would say just because of bad luck, but most of it boils down to just bad planning. And we have 1921 to 23, what my grandmother was talking about, the Great Famine. This is where 5 million Russians died over simply the fact that they couldn't plan because of the new communistic system. 5 million people in Russia. Then we go to China, and China knows how to have a real famine. In fact, the vast majority of the world's biggest famines are all centered in China. But all of them seem to pale in comparison to what Mao did in the 1959 to 61. That's right, that's our time. Close enough. Many of you can remember that. Of course, it wasn't widely publicized, but it was all about his efforts and the great leap forward. He was trying to mechanize the entire country and failed miserably. They don't know how many people died in the great leap forward. They believe it's between 17 million and 45 million people died in that handful of years of starvation. See, the reality is starvation and the idea of starvation or a famine is inconvenient to most of us who haven't seen it. When we come to chapter number 10, we realize that this is a massive escalation over what God has seen so far. God has already hit their economic system extremely badly, devastated it. He has already given them several warnings when we talk about the frogs and the flies, things that are inconvenient, potentially harmful, but nowhere near like what we're going to see in chapter number 10. What I find interesting as we begin to look into this passage, we find that God in his mercy doesn't just first show his power, but he tells Pharaoh exactly what's going to happen. See, unlike whatever is going on with all of our food plants around the world, God understands the incredible amount of suffering that can come about as a result of this plague. Hence the reason he seems to give a warning first. We serve a merciful God. That's where we come and find in verse number 1 of chapter number 10. And the Lord said unto Pharaoh, or the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I might show these my signs before him, and that thou mayest tell in the ears of thy son and of thy son's son what things I have wrought in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, that ye may know how that I am the Lord. Let's open up in a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your goodness and your love to us. Lord, as we begin to look at these devastating plagues of chapter number 10, we ask you to please open up our hearts, help us to understand your love, your plan, your power. But Lord, also help us to have hearts that are tender to your leading, that we might be able to trust and follow all of your commands and to live as you would have us. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Of course, chapter number 10 is right after all the hail and the rain has just ended. As a result of this terrific weather of chapter number 9 that God has sent, Egypt is reeling in an economic sense. They have lost the vast majority of their livestock. They have also lost everything that was in the field at that time. But we do know that according to the end of chapter number 9, they aren't facing a famine quite yet. The Bible tells us in verse number 31, And the flax and the barley was smitten, for the barley was in the ear, and the flax was bold. But, verse number 32, the wheat and the rye were not smitten, for they were not yet grown up. So God has still given them enough seed so that they can make it through the year. It will be lean. Everybody is going to lose a few pounds. No one's going to be exactly happy about what they're going to eat, but it's not quite starvation level yet. Then we come to chapter number 10, and God is going to send his warning. He sends Moses and Aaron over to Pharaoh in verse number 3. And Moses and Aaron came in unto Pharaoh and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, How long wilt thou refuse to humble thyself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me. Of course, as we begin to look at this, we understand that God has this all planned out. God understands the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. We've all heard the argument about why in the world does God allow wicked people, evil people in this world to prosper? There's a huge debate in the book of Job, and it goes on for chapters and chapters and chapters. There's also a debate whenever we look at men like Hitler, which just about everyone in the world dislikes, or anybody else that would fit into that same category. Why, God, do you permit it? Well, God tells us in the beginning of this chapter, he tells us very clearly that this is because that he wants to show his power. It says that God has hardened his heart, in verse number 1, and the heart of his servants, that I may show these my signs before him. God says, I want to be a witness to the people of Egypt and to my own people. Not only that, verse number 2, and that thou mayest tell in the ears of thy son and of thy son's son what things I have wrought in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, that ye may know how that I am the Lord. See, God says this very clear that this is for his glory. He wants us to know him better. We've all had experience in our lives, I dare say, that have drawn us closer to the Lord because it made us realize we needed him more. That seems to be what he's saying here. But he also says, I want everyone else to know that I am God as well. I want the Egyptians to know I'm God. I want them to know that I have power over their gods. I want them to know that not only that, I want all the people that you will one day meet. I want your grandchildren to know and your great-grandchildren to all know that I am God. This is the reason why there are movies made about this passage of Scripture. Interesting. We don't know everything that happened in our ancestors' history, at least not this far back, but we know this story because this is a story of God's power and his mercy. Hence the reason why God's mission was very successful here. We all remember the plagues of Egypt. We remember also when we get to Joshua that we spoke of on Sunday, this is again reiterated in Joshua. God says, I want your children to know. I want them to remember my power. Anyways, as we see all this, God is making it very clear that he has power. We also can commend Moses here because we'll notice that Moses doesn't necessarily complain. Remember early on when Pharaoh said no, what did Moses do? He began asking God why. He started having a pity party, if you remember. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't have one here. We can't argue from the silence of Scripture. But it does seem noticeably absent. It seems at the very least he continues to serve God and immediately goes and does what he's told. So moving on, we see he goes into Pharaoh. He tells him exactly what he said, what God has said. But not just that, he's going to go on, he's going to begin to describe to Pharaoh what's going to happen if Pharaoh doesn't get his heart right. He starts off by saying, of course, "How long wilt thou refuse to humble thyself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me." So we see God's plan here very clearly, but he's making it very clear also that Pharaoh's problem is his pride. That seems to be the root of most of our problems as well. Logically, Pharaoh would have let these people go long ago. He should have already cut his losses and run, as we would have said. They're no longer profitable. They're simply troublesome. Either execute them all or let them all go free. But don't put up with this nonsense, Pharaoh. It's no longer profitable. But what's keeping him from doing that? His own pride. That's why he is told to humble himself. But we also see in God's instructions are pretty clear. He says, "Let my people go, that they may serve me." Yet again, the purpose, that they may serve me. Then we see the threat. He says, "Else if thou refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow will I bring the locust into thy coast, and they shall cover the face of the earth, that one cannot be able to see the earth. And they shall eat the residue of that which is escaped, which remaineth unto you from the hail, and shall eat every tree which groweth for you out of the field." Basically, it says, so far I've nearly destroyed everything that you have, Pharaoh. Almost. But I've left you just enough to survive. Now the question is, do you want that, or do you want to merely survive and obey me, or do you want me to completely break your country? Now this is a very interesting one. He's made it very clear that this is what's going to happen. He goes a little bit further. He says, "I want you to also know that this is going to be not only devastating for you, not only are you going to face a genuine famine, but everyone's going to know it." Verse number 6, "And they shall fill thy houses, and the houses of all thy servants, and the houses of all the Egyptians, which neither thy fathers nor thy fathers' fathers have seen, since the day that they were upon the earth unto this day." And he turned himself and went out from Pharaoh. So this is a pretty big deal. He says, I'm going to send them so far, and they're going to destroy everything you have. But not only that, I'm also going to make sure they appear everywhere. They're going to get through your doors and your windows and your screens. We understand in our world, if something terrible happens, most of governments around the world have alternative plans. Yeah, I remember living up in West Virginia, and there were quite a few places in the hills of West Virginia, from what I'm told, at least in different time periods, where all the elites from Washington would come and run and hide. Whether it was the Greenbrier, and underneath they had this beautiful, you can actually go visit it nowadays, but this beautiful bunker underneath this giant hotel way up in the hills. Or if you go into a little bit into Virginia, they actually had the Workers' Complex, and this was buried deep into a mountain, but they only had enough food for about 2 or 3 months, whereas the Greenbrier could sustain life for a whole lot longer than that. The idea was that these people in this secondary location would just get the government running in exile and then die off. The people in the Greenbrier would be around to come back up and reset up the government afterwards. A little disturbing to think about, but the idea is that no matter what happens in our world, the elite can survive it. At least they don't have to put up with it. God says that's not the way this is going to work. What's going to happen here, Pharaoh, is in your bedroom, and even the elite of your world, they will all see my locust as a continual reminder of the fact that I broke you with something that comes out of the sky. Of course, this is yet another affront to their sky god. The fact that, see, your sky god couldn't even protect your skies from a little locust. It's interesting, I started looking up the greatest swarms that they believe they've ever had of locusts, in recent memory at least. Interesting, one of the biggest ones was actually out west, here in this country. Supposedly, it was known, of course, as Albert Swarm, and it was concentrated around the Rocky Mountain locust, and it swarmed in 1875. The physician who named it was named after Albert Child, a physician at the time, and he calculated the size of this swarm to be 198,000 square miles in size. Basically, that means he multiplied it by estimating the speed it would take it to move through the southern portion of Nebraska. From my understanding, this swarm actually would cover up to several different states at a time. It was that large. It was estimated to the number of locusts in that particular swarm was 3.5 trillion. Other people estimate it to be up to 12.5 trillion locusts in that one swarm. Now, I don't know which one's right, and I'm not sure why there's a discrepancy. But regardless, at that number, I don't think it really matters. They are going to eat everything. There's going to be nothing left. Now imagine a swarm bigger than this even, that would cover a state or two entirely. God says these are going to cover the ground and nearly blot out the sky. It's going to change the color of the sky because of the number. There's going to be nothing left for your people to eat. So are you sure you want this to happen? Now let's go into one other piece before we see exactly what God does. We see that Pharaoh seems to have pulled back and had a little cabinet meeting back behind closed doors. And he's given some very good advice in verse number 7. And Pharaoh's servant said unto him, How long shall this man be a snare unto us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? The word destroyed here is the idea to perish or to vanish or to be destroyed. It's the idea that Egypt is very close to being entirely wiped off the map just because of these numerous different plagues. Basically, they're saying, see, in my mind, I imagine this nice little cabinet meeting of all these rather erudite cabinet members trying to coach a rather immature Pharaoh on what he should and should not do. And perhaps one of them that's a little bit better at spinning it for Pharaoh and getting him to listen says, Pharaoh, yes, you can rule them you can rule over them forever, but you're not going to have anything to rule over for much longer. We're all going to be dead if these plagues continue. Just think about it, Pharaoh. We all rule under this illusion of power, the fact that the people think they can't revolt because the gods are on our side, but all the gods have been proven to be weak and not even able to stand against this one. Won't be long before the people are revolting. There's nothing left for the people to eat if this happens. It's kind of the idea of the mutually assured destruction of a nuclear fallout, if it goes all out as some would suggest. It's interesting, anytime there's ever been food shortages, even polite people get a little wacky. If you go back into history, I found this one out recently. Of course, I've grown fascinated with the Dutch Empire. It was the empire that preceded directly before the English one, arguably much more powerful. It was in the middle of the Dutch Empire, it was getting towards the end of it, but still in their heyday. It was in the mid-1600s. And at that time, they actually had a prime minister. And things were going relatively well until all of a sudden the Germans and the English and I think the French all kind of sort of started going against the Dutch all at the same time. And they were scared. And scared people get a little crazy. And that's exactly what happened in 1620 in the 1600s. Evidently, they had a prime minister by the name of Johann de Witt. And evidently, between the food shortages and the fear of the incoming armies, all these highly educated, highly civilized people had had enough. They walked into the Parliament building, marched their prime minister in the streets, lynched him, lynched his brother, and then ate them, just to make a point. I guess there's always a use for a politician somewhere. I just wouldn't have thought of that one. But that was their solution to the problem, to prove their point. Evidently, if you go over there now, of course, these are the same people that had the pretty windmills and the nice, cute wooden shoes and the tulips. Those people ate their prime minister just to prove a point. And evidently, they still celebrate the day they ate him over there. Some unusual. I guess it makes sense. I mean, it is part of their history. I get it. It seems very strange to me. I mean, we celebrate the Boston Tea Party, but this seems a bit extreme in my taste. But the reality is that's kind of what Pharaoh's advisors must have been thinking as well. As they realize there's nothing left for us to rule over. They realize that all the people are going to be starving soon. And these are not the Dutch. These are people that are going to be much more prone to violence, at least culturally speaking. Perhaps one of the other cabinets says, you know, Pharaoh, one of my neighbors has been looking at me a little funny. He brought home a great big pot the other day. We need to do something different. I don't know. Whatever the case, they advise him very clearly, you need to change your course. There is nothing left of Egypt if you keep doing this. His cabinet understands God's power very clearly. Moving on, however, sadly, this doesn't change their perspective. Verse number 8, and Moses and Aaron were brought again unto Pharaoh, and he said unto them, go, serve the Lord your God. But who are they that shall go? So Pharaoh starts it by saying, okay, you can go. We'll let you. But who's going to go exactly? And Moses says, we will go with our young and with our old and with our sons and with our daughters. And with our flocks and with our herds will we go, for we must hold a feast unto the Lord. He says, we are all going to go serve the Lord together. Verse number 10, however, Pharaoh responds by saying, let the Lord be so with you, as I will let you go, and your little ones, look to it, for evil is before you. He's being sarcastic here. Now he comes in verse number 11, he says, not so. Go now ye that are men, and serve the Lord, for that ye did desire. And they were driven out of Pharaoh's presence, from Pharaoh's presence. So he tells them very clearly, you can go if you're the men, but leave the women and children behind. Now, there are two possible options for this. Either option number one is maybe he's holding them hostage to make sure the men come back. The second one that I can think of, maybe there's another. The other one is he's afraid that these young people will be, to use the modern word, indoctrinated into the ways of the Lord. Seems like every dictator around the world has always been very concerned with the education system. In fact, we hear it nowadays too. Oh, those Bible stories are too severe for children to hear. Oh, the blood of Christ, the cross, the resurrection, those are fairy tales. You shouldn't be telling your children. You can worship it, but just don't tell those innocent ears. Sadly, that's exactly what happened here. It's what happened in different places around the world, and we can point to them. But the reality is Moses says no. We all must go. So we see this first rejection of the plague of the locusts is rooted around the fact of who is going. Pharaoh still wants to maintain control, maybe not of the men, but he has to maintain control of the children. And Moses says no. And of course, as a result, they're driven out of Pharaoh's presence. We see this many times, as we've spoken of it recently. We've had people talk about all the time about whose children are they really? Are they the government's or are they the parents? And I'm a little uncomfortable with that concept. I heard recently a conservative commentator say, our children are our most valuable possessions. I understand the thinking and I can sympathize, but it's not biblical. You can't own another human being. You don't have the right to own another human soul. They are God's. We use the term for teachers, they're in the place of the parent. Well, the reality is a parent is in the place of God. They're there as the steward of God to be able to provide. Well, Moses understands this. He says, no, you don't have any control over our children, and he's willing to risk the repercussions. Of course, so is Pharaoh. And of course, verse number 12, and the Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand over the land of Egypt and for the locust, that they may come up from the land of Egypt and eat every herb of the land, even all that the hail hath left. Is exactly what happens. As they come in, the east wind brings them in. They're over the entire land. They're very grievous in verse number 14. And also it says, verse number 15, they covered the face of the whole earth so that the land was darkened, and they did eat every herb of the land. Of course, Pharaoh is in absolute terror now when he realized what's happening. Starvation is inevitable, or at least some of the people are going to starve. Verse number 16, he called for Moses and Aaron in haste. And he said, I have sinned against the Lord your God. and against you. Now therefore forgive, I pray thee, my sin only, this once, and entreat the Lord your God, that he may take away from me this death only. And he went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord, and the Lord turned a mighty strong west wind, and took away the locust, and cast them into the Red Sea. There remained not one locust in all the coast of Egypt, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that he would not let the children of Israel go. It is beautiful. We're going to get to our second plague tonight. But as we begin to look at it, we see that God shows his power very strongly. He has, of course, just disproved the power of Set yet again. The fact that he has control over the winds that bring the locusts and the winds that blow them away. Tragically for the people of Egypt, they've kind of lost out as a result. They now have no more produce in the fields, and they're not going to have a harvest as a result of the fact that the locusts have eaten everything out of the field. So what is our point tonight? We have a couple different points. We can see, of course, the hardness of these individuals' hearts. We can see, of course, that God most certainly does have power over everything in life, whether it be in this type of scenario where it's the natural realm, or whether it be in applying it to our setting as well, also over even the economic realm as well. This is absolutely devastating, but we still saw God's mercy, the fact he cared for the people of Egypt. But ultimately we see that God was faithful to Moses because Moses continued to do as God had told him to do, even when society told him not to minister as he was supposed to. So the promise for us is pretty simple. God most certainly will take care of us. Yes, God will lead us in places maybe we don't expect or wish to go, but he most certainly has power over everything in our world, and he can protect and guide us as we need to. And of course, the last application is the fact we have a responsibility to the next generation. This particular chapter started off with a concern of God being able to show his power to every generation, and it ends this plague with a concern of Moses to be able to teach the next generation to serve God as well. So what are we doing? I know many times we have people who take care of their grandkids, people who take care of their children, people who teach Sunday school. Each of us is touching somebody else's life, typically someone younger than us. As a result, we need to remember that when we do so, it's all well and good to teach someone how to cook or change the oil in a car, to tell someone the stories of the times gone by, to instill with them good patriotic values. Let's remember what is truly most important, and that's pointing them to the God that we serve, the God that has all the answers. Just a moment, I'd like to go and call on a few people to pray. Continue to remember that we have a God that does answer and can hear us, and does expect to have us call upon him. Please especially remember Faith tonight, that God will just give her the grace and the strength she needs, as well as the family. Also, please continue to pray for the Lacey's, that they would recover quickly.